let's talk about death. Today's topic is about how to write a character's death and how a well written death of a character is essential to the storyline. Now you need to understand that whenever we talk about a character's death, there has to be a significant reason for it, unless you're writing in an absurd manner or a comedic manner. That's up to you. But if it's a drama, if it's one of those short stories which aspire people to think about a subject matter, when you're dealing with death, you need to understand that a character's death needs redemption. No matter who the character is. Now, when I say no matter who the character is, if the character is an antagonist and you are made to hate the character so far, the redemption for the character's death will be the satisfaction you get once the character has been erased off. Similarly, there are so many tangents on which characters need to establish their death, and it depends on who the character is. Now, when you're writing, unlike real life, I'm not going to touch upon real life. A death of a character is when the character has achieved its entire arc and then you decide to take the character off for the plot to move on. Now, the character can be either the protagonist, someone close to the protagonist. If it's an entourage, then one of the members. It can be the antagonist. It can be someone close to the antagonist. That can lead to the motive of the antagonist to do the wrong things. It can be someone who's a random person, but that the death of that person triggers a lot of incidences. So, how to deal with a death of a character? How to deal with writing such? There's a line, and there are two extreme points when we are talking about death of a character. It can either be silent or it can be a single chapter death continuation. By silent, I mean it's over in a word. Like, for example, there's an incident happening, there's action. The character who's about to die and the protagonist, they are both in a situation where the character is about to die. We may know it, we may not know it, but the character is about to die and the protagonist is with him. Now when we are dealing about single word deaths, when you are dealing with single word deaths, a gunshot, or a knife to the back, or the character jumping off a high building, or a blast. These come under the single word death scene. You can stretch those into a chapter as well, but these are usually the single word death scenes, unlike the single chapter death scenes, which are a long illness, or after the gunshot, if the person has not yet lost enough blood, and you can stretch that scene. So something so simple as silence can indicate a single word death scene. For example, a wound to the chest, and there was silence. You can end the chapter here for a cliffhanger, or you can switch to the next para, or if you want to continue, you can continue with describing what comes after the silence. So in this case, there would be the, if you are going into details, there would be the eyes of the character, eyes of the protagonist, noticing that his friend has had a wound to the chest. There can be a scream breaking the silence. There can be the character himself realizing that he has had a fatal injury and is about to die. His internal monologue. Next step, away from the single word one, the monologue thing. Not many people use monologue as to describe a death scene when there are other people around. Usually a monologue is when the person is alone and is about to die, and they have this internal conscience about them, and you're right about that. A monologue is when, if beautifully used, it's when the character is around other people as well, but it's his internal vision. Now, since no one knows what happens when we die because the person dies, we not exactly know what happens internally, thought wise. There's panic, or there's peace, there's acceptance, there's conflict between having left something undone, or there's satisfaction. So when we're talking about internal monologues, after the shot to the chest, the person who's about to die is breathing his last breath. That character can have a very beautiful monologue of how his own character arc is complete in itself. Redemption. No matter who the character was, he may have turned to the other side, he may have betrayed his protagonist friend, he may have done something else, he may have committed a crime, he may have become the antagonist at one point, but internal monologue can either be him accepting that it's fine and it's time for him to go, or his regrets. That was the monologue part. The very next thing scene wise is how his death impacts other people. Now, dealing with this scenario comes with the responsibility of taking that scene and stretching it a little, because this point onwards, whatever happens in the story is a consequence of the person's death. Since the person is a main character in the story, significant character in the story, everything from this point on has the responsibility of creating a consequence of the character's death which impacts the plot. This is where the paragraph to a chapter to 3 chapters kind of a story comes. Now, in this scenario, the next best thing is the person closest to the character to realize that a character is about to die or the character has fallen. I'm going to continue the gunshot example, but I'll include other things as well once we are done with elaborating the paragraph to the chapter thing. Before I forget, there's a very important thing you need to keep in mind when you're writing a death scene. You cannot extend a death scene after a certain point, unless you're talking about afterlife. That's not part of the death scene. Or you're trying to be comedic with the scene and the character has had his moment, everyone has have accepted that the character is about to die, but he's not dead yet, so he's just laying there looking at that. Unless you're trying to do that, you cannot extend a character, you can't milk the character's death to a point where you just want to keep the reader's attention throughout the story. Even the reader will get bored after a point. So you need to realize the limit. You need to realize every character has a certain moment of death, after which you will just make it boring for the character, for the reader to continue reading the death of the character. So the paragraph thing is when the surrounding notices that the person who's about to die has fallen. When a person falls, this is where some people are shocked. Some people have already accepted the character's death. Some people are overwhelmed. Some people rush to the character, trying to save him, even though they know that they won't be able to save the person. Some people regret not being there for the character when this person needed them or their help or something previously in the story. If we expand out of this venue of death, there are other people who may be close to the character who got the news of the character dying. If it's an important person, there may be media, and through media there may be thousands of people, and you can revolve the camera around their faces, of them accepting, of them getting hit by the news of this person dying. Thousands of people. And this is a lengthy process. So, when you're dealing with this kind of a thing, you usually tend to keep two things in mind. First, that the character is actually fatally injured. And second, whatever your next plot line is, this is going to be the triggering factor for it. So after this, if the protagonist gets to come to the climax, this would be the reason for the protagonist to break his point of conscious and then consciously go after the antagonist. Or if we are seeing this story from the antagonist's perspective, this is the celebratory moment of the antagonist, of him knowing that this person is dead, which is why the protagonist will break down. And there are other people who are also affected by this person's death. You can start writing this from the protagonist's perspective, but it would be better if you start with the perspective of the person who was closest to the character who's dying. From there on, you build a relationship with the protagonist. From there on, you build the relationship with other people around the person. And that concludes the duration of a character's death point. Now, when we're talking about illness, if the person is suffering for a long time, he can either be in a hospital setting or in his own room, or he may have collapsed in a random place, and from there on it's just panic and suffering for the other people, for other people, until the person who's dealing with the illness regains conscious. If the person regains conscious, there's scope for dialogue. If the person passes after losing consciousness, then there's scope for other people to continue from that point on. In case of violence, I've already made it somewhat clear what happens in a violent scene. In case of a natural calamity, a natural disaster, that can be a triggering factor for the protagonist's motive to seek something. The protagonist losing his family in a natural calamity or a natural disaster can be a reason or a motive for the protagonist to continue seeking justice for his family. There are other things which affect death, and there are other characters who influence death. The ideal death of a character which is closest to reality will be the character going in peace, surrounded by his family, or in his sleep. That's the ideal, the most peaceful way the person exits the scene. But in a storyline, the ideal death of a character is what keeps the plot going. And you need to keep in mind that no matter, I'm talking about a serious genre like a drama or something motivation, something of a social issue, or even other genres like mythology or romance or adventure, crime. When we're dealing with these, we need to keep in mind the genre of the death. In a romantic genre, the death of a partner reflects pain, and it continues to reflect pain until the story ends. In an adventure genre, death of a teammate can be a motivating factor for the other characters to achieve what they had set to achieve. It will be immensely painful for the other characters, but the death will lead to their casual adventure and give it a very serious motivation as to be some sort of a tribute to the person who passed. In a drama, the death of a character leads to other people's moral conflicts. In a crime, the death of a teammate, a gang member, will lead to revenge, or either revenge or the members to leave this life of crime. So when dealt with death, you need to keep in mind what the genre is. Otherwise, the character will die in vain. And that's all I had to say. Like, share, subscribe, etc., etc. And keep in mind that death, however painful it may be, it's not the end of a story. The story goes on until life ends. That's it.